Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second lecture for this week, week two, on power, influence, and explaining political outcomes. In this mini lecture, we're going to be complicating the picture of power and influence that we had in the first lecture when we looked at Robert Dahl's question of who governs and compared elitist and pluralist conceptions of power, by looking at John Gaventa's work to think about the different ways that power functions in societies beyond just kind of direct resources for influencing outcomes. So our goals today are to define and describe the three faces of power, and then begin thinking about how we can apply these to help us explain politics. We're going to go through Gaventa's argument and discussion of the three faces of power. We're going to talk about what the different mechanisms of these faces of power are, and to add a little bit of depth to the third face of power, we're going to talk a little bit about American political culture. So, what is power? Now, we tend to kind of think about power as the ability to influence people, the ability to change things. It's kind of like a definition borrowed from physics. But in his 1980 book, Power and Powerlessness, John Gaventa raises this question of like, well, why don't oppressed groups rebel? Like when there are significant group subordination and inequality and domination, why do we see rebellion sometimes and why not other times? Why don't the powerless, act against the powerful? Why do the powerless appear to consent to their own domination? And this is kind of his research question. And most of the book actually focuses on the Appalachian Valley and the extraction of coal and other resources from them, and the destruction of communities and local industry and economies there. But the book starts with this theoretical construction of a more nuanced conception of power. That his argument is that political scientists haven't fully grasped the way that power functions. And he argues that we actually need to think about how power functions in three different ways. That there's the first phase of power, which is what we were talking about last class, which who has the ability to influence political decisions? How do we change people's decisions? But he also says that there's a form of power that is non-decisional, the ability of power to prevent an issue from even becoming discussed. And this is what he calls the second phase of power. And then there's an even more subtle form of power, which he calls the third phase. So we can call ideological or sociological power, which is the ability to shape people's own conceptions of values and preferences in the first place. So let's dig into this in a little more detail. The first phase of power is pretty familiar, should be pretty standard. It's if we have two people, if person B wants to currently pursue option X, right? If they're going to vote for a bill for Medicare for all, for example, one way that we can think about power is the ability for person A to do something to get person B to do something they otherwise would not do. As he defines on page 5, A has power over B to the extent that they can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do, right? So B wants to vote for Medicare for all, but person A exerts some sort of power and influence over them to get them to do something they don't want to do. They don't have to change their mind, right? B still wants to vote for Medicare for all, but A, maybe it's lobbying, maybe it's electoral threats, whatever. They are able to get them to do something they don't want to do. And this is, we can call this is the kind of power that Dahl was talking about in Who Governs that we talked about last mini lecture, right? It's who is in charge, who governs, who is able to influence decisions in an open system, right? It's focusing on individual people's behavior. It's focusing on the idea of self-interested people. And what this seems to imply, though, is that B is consenting in some respect to A's power, right? They are doing something they don't want to do. They're not resisting it. And so Gaventa thinks that because of that kind of weirdness, that it makes it seem like the powerless are consenting to the power of the powerful. That doesn't always happen, right? So clearly there must be something more going on because sometimes people resist and rebel. They don't always just go along with exertions of influence. So there must be so the fact that some people resist and some people don't means that there's something else going on in the cases where people, in these cases, to explain what's happening. It also has a really individualized focus. It ignores history. It ignores institutional rules and procedures. It ignores the context of action. It just kind of assumes these two people are acting in a vacuum. And as he summarizes on page 8, the power of A is thought to affect the action of B, but it's not considered a factor relevant to why B does not act in a manner that B otherwise might, were he not powerless relative to A. So it just kind of assumes that B would act otherwise. But what if B doesn't act otherwise, even if there's not direct influence? And this leads to what Gaventa calls the second phase of power. And this is also called non-decisional power, because he argues that power isn't just when you try to influence other people in the decision-making arena, when you try to get members of Congress to vote the way you want them to vote, even if that's not the way they want to vote, by offering them votes or money or what have you. That power is also exercised towards what he calls the exclusion of certain participants and issues altogether. He otherwise calls this the mobilization of bias, but the second phase of power means you don't even have to make the decision because you prevent option X from even coming into the political arena, right? The fact that that you don't even consider raising this issue. You don't have to convince you don't have to convince person B to do something they don't want to do. You just prevent person B from having a political voice. You prevent option X. You prevent something like Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, these more radical political positions from even getting raised in the first place, right? So you mobilize, whether it's through institutional rules or whether it's through cultural values, you try to prevent these issues from being raised in the first place. And this means that apparent inaction within the political process by deprived groups is actually related to power. Which is in turn revealed in participation and non-participation on issues and non-issues, which arise or are prevented from arising in decision-making arenas. And this idea, like power isn't just the ability to influence people, to get people to do what you want them to do, but in the second phase of power, you don't even have to exert that influence, right? You just prevent the issue from being arising. The real power in this sense means you don't even have to try to get people to act otherwise. You don't have to try to change people's behavior. You just prevent an issue from ever coming into like public consciousness. But there are also limitations here. How do what Gaventa on page 11 calls conceptions of grievances even get formed in the first place, right? How do these option X's, option Y's actually even get developed? Where do people get these ideas? Where do people get where do people develop the beliefs that something is wrong, that something has to change or not in the first place? And what if people it's not just never even conceive of a challenge to the status quo because it's taken for granted that the status quo is the way things should be? So in this case, like, what if it's not even that we don't ever have a vote on Medicare for all or the Green New Deal, or that we exclude certain people from participating in politics? What if we can't even think of these alternatives? What if we don't even have to exclude people from politics and from formal decision making because they never even consider engaging in political deliberation and political action in the first place, right? And this points to the third phase of power. And this is the idea that not only might A exercise power over B by prevailing in the resolution of the key issues, that's the first phase of power, getting them to do something they don't want to do, or by preventing B from effectively raising those issues, the second phase of power, but also through affecting B's conception of the issues altogether. And we can think of this as ideological power, that it's not simply about getting someone to pursue a political choice that they don't want to make or preventing them from even raising a political alternative. It's shaping their conception of the political in the first place so that you've actually changed their interests, you've changed their values, that they don't even consider option X because they have been so culturally and ideologically and sociologically conditioned, for lack of a better word, to assume that there is no alternative. So they don't even raise the question in the first place. So that's pretty abstract. So what are the actual mechanisms of power? How does this actually work? And so if we're thinking about the first phase of power, the obvious answer that we might look for is coercion, right? That you threaten B in order to get B to do what they don't want to do, right? You get them to, they say they want to do option X, but you threaten them with violence and they do option Y. And as I'm recording this lecture, as armed insurgents have literally stormed the Capitol and building and in an attempt to prevent the certification of the presidential election, it's hard to dismiss this as a form of power. But usually in political science, at least in the function in stable functioning liberal democracies, we think of this first phase of power more in terms of political resources, votes, jobs, influence, money that can be brought to political actors to the bargaining game. Right. So politician A might try to get politician B to vote for or against a bill by offering support on a different bill, right? A group of citizens might try to get their elected representative to vote for a certain way on a bill by saying that we won't vote for you, or we won't give you money, or we will give you money, or we will vote for you, depending on how they act. So this is that kind of pluralist conception of power, that people can influence the decision-making arena by mobilizing resources, right? By banding together and creating electoral incentives for politicians to vote in particular ways, right? This is the kind of standard issue. So we can, by using these resources, we can get person B to vote against what they would rather do. When we're talking about the second phase of power, the mechanisms are a little bit more complex and they can function in a bunch of different ways. So Gaventa defines these mechanisms as the values, beliefs, rituals, and institutional procedures that operate systematically and consistently to benefit of certain persons and groups at the expense of others. So in the most stark cases, we can think of literal disenfranchisement, which this country had for large numbers of the population, including women, including people without property, including slaves and their descendants for a majority of its history. But these people were literally excluded from the political process. They were literally excluded from the halls of power, from the decision-making arena. And this exclusion is like the most extreme form of the mobilization of bias. You prevent women from raising the issue. You prevent slaves and their descendants from raising grievances altogether. But it can also function a bit more subtly, both through efforts at voter suppression, but also simply with like institutional rules, things like the filibuster, right? The fact that you could, we'll talk about this when we talk about Congress, right? That you can prevent a bill from passing that has majority support, if it doesn't have enough votes to pass a cloture motion, means that certain issues are never actually going to get raised, right? The institutional rules that allow the Speaker of the House and allow the Senate Majority Leader to just set the agenda in Congress means that they can simply not raise certain issues, right? And so you have all these institutional features that exclude certain grievances, issues, political agents from the decision-making process altogether, that you don't have to exert any influence, you don't have to mobilize resources to change their mind or to get them to act differently. You just exclude them altogether. Now, the third phase of power is a bit harder to pin down because it's a bit more pervasive. It's not simply a one-to-one issue. This is why I call it sociological power sometimes. It's about how society as a whole kind of is socialized, how people are socialized to form, how people form political beliefs and values and interests and preferences in the first place. And Gaventa talks about the importance of social myths, languages, and symbols. So how we kind of come to articulate political values and political beliefs in the first place, and the social construction of meanings and patterns, right? So what do we think is actually appropriate for politics in the first place? What are the kind of realms of political possibility are a function of our kind of shared social language and symbols and myths and social values, which aren't really about like A exerting power over B so much. And this can happen in kind of indirect ways with control of information, with propaganda, with education and socialization. But it also happens indirectly. It also happens, as Gaventa focuses more on in pages 16 through 19, that the powerless come to internalize their own powerlessness and legitimize and justify their own powerlessness by becoming used to losing in the political arena. They develop an apolitical consciousness. They say, why should I even bother voting? Because the two parties are the same. Or why should I spend my time and energy getting voting this election when no one ever actually cares about my issues, because my issues have been so excluded from the political arena in the first place. This can create a culture of silence that we don't, especially, you can think about the extent to which, for large periods of history, like issues of queer rights, were never even really raised in mainstream political consciousness, right? It just created a culture of silence. And you can also have what Marxist writers would call false consciousness, what the sociologist and philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois calls split consciousness, dual consciousness in African Americans, or false consciousness in the lower classes, that you kind of have an internalization of your own oppression, that you start to like speak the language of the powerful to justify your own powerlessness. So Gaventa argues that these forms of power build on each other and reinforce each other. So let's take a look at this fancy chart. This fancy chart that he gives us on page 21 here of the reading. So it starts with the first dimension, right? That you're able to gain power and influence the initial decisions through superior resources, right? Whether it's outright coercion, right? You have threats of violence and greater power, coercive power, or through greater economic resources or greater electoral resources, right? But then you don't want to have to keep fighting that battle. And so you move from this to the second phase. You start building institutional rules to reinforce your power, to prevent the powerless from even raising the issue again in the first place, right? You mobilize biases, you create institutional rules that exclude certain ways. And then over time, this ends up reinforcing itself and creating certain ideologies, certain cultural values and myths that reinforce that power, in which you don't even need these formal institutional barriers to entry, because people don't even consider contesting the status quo, right? And then you have a parallel track here with the powerlessness, right? They initially lose the first debate over the issue. Then the powerful prevent them from raising the issue again by erecting barriers. And this like repeated failure then makes them more susceptible to myths, ideologies, legitimations that inculcate this sense of powerlessness, right? And what this ends up doing is that you get a situation where you have the acquiescence of power inequalities, where the powerless, those on the bottom end of social, political, and economic inequalities, don't resist these inequalities. They don't fight back. They don't try to change them. And it looks like they're consenting to their own subordination. But what's actually happened is that these three faces of power have become layered on each other. Now, to overcome this, Gaventa says, this is this bottom part of the chart here, is that you need to kind of work backwards through the three faces of power. That you first need to engage in what feminist political theorists would call consciousness raising. You need to get people aware that there is a problem in the first place, that the formulation of issues, right? This idea that things don't have to be this way, that we could do things differently, that there's a real problem here. Then you have to start breaking down the barriers to prevent this issue from being raised, right? You need to get people elected. You need to change the institutional rules to allow for these issues to be debated. And then you need to, once that is done, mobilize resources in order to get enough people to support the issue, right? And that's the way that you kind of challenge this situation of powerlessness, by kind of working backwards through these three phases. So, what are some of the myths, ideologies, and legitimations of power inequalities in the United States, you might ask, right? Especially this is ostensibly, right, a country that is based on the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men and asterisk are created equal, right? We are a constitutional democracy, a democratic republic, whatever word you want to use. What kind of social myths legitimate these inequalities? Well, for a long period of time, lots of commentators and political scientists and historians have argued that there's a liberal consensus in American political culture. This goes back to the French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville's argument that the striking thing about the United States is this passion for equality. Hartz, the political scientist, 20th century political scientist Louis Hartz, argued that there's a liberal tradition in the United States that ultimately what we see in the United States is not because we never had a feudal tradition or a monarchy, that the United States' default position is a kind of liberalism. But this ideology of liberalism, of this idea of like equality and individual rights, and we'll talk about liberalism a bit more in a couple of weeks, actually shapes the way that we think about politics. That it gives us this kind of ideology of a rugged individual, that all like the individual should just pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? That we just need to kind of work hard, and we should be rewarded for that hard work. It kind of helps us understand the lack of a socialist party, a real viable socialist party in the United States, right? That it's outside the pale of what we would accept as legitimate politics. It explains the relative weakness of labor movements in this country. And it also you get this kind of recurring debate in American discourse about like individualism versus collectivism, whether it's in the Cold War, whether it's in debates over the healthcare debates over the Affordable Care Act or Medicare for All, or even the kind of discussion about around COVID-19, right? That like we have to embrace American individualism. We can't have these collectivist or communist or socialist solutions, right? And what that's doing is shaping the way that we can even conceive of political alternatives. But that's not the only thing happening in American political culture. And again, the events of this afternoon, January 6th, 2021, should confirm this. That in 1993, the American political scientist Roger Smith wrote an article in the American Political Science Review called The Multiple Traditions. And he argues that we shouldn't think of American politics as simply expressing this idea of liberalism or republicanism, but also what he calls forms of ascriptive Americanism or ascriptive hierarchies. That while there have been beliefs and an extensive kind of claim about equality and liberal institutions and rule of law, that these have always sat alongside in kind of an uneasy but like always accepted alliance with these ascriptive hierarchies, these definitions of who a real American is, right? That the same documents that proclaimed the Republican institutions of the Constitution also legally protected the slave trade and the rights of human beings to own other human beings as property and disenfranchise women from the vote. That we've kind of always had these traditions that would say that all men are not created equal, that we actually have distinct hierarchies between the deserving and the undeserving, that there are real Americans and not real Americans. And these have also shaped people's values, beliefs, and preferences. The sociologist Jonathan Metzl recently wrote a book called The Dying of Whiteness. And he argues that a lot of the opposition by many white, rural, non-college educated Americans to things that would benefit them, like stronger labor unions, stronger worker industrial regulations, stronger healthcare policy. They oppose them because they view that these policies are viewed overwhelmingly as benefiting the wrong people, whether they're usually people of color or immigrants or other undeserving people, right? And so these shape kind of these traditions of both liberalism and republicanism, but also these like competing conceptions of who really gets to be an American shape our conceptions of like what is politically possible and what is politically viable. So this ideological power is much kind of more tenacious and widespread. It's not simply about like the president getting on Twitter and spouting propaganda. This is also about kind of the shared stories that we tell ourselves as a country. So next week, we're going to shift gears from the kind of more abstract theory and start talking a little bit about history, the historical foundations of American politics. And we're starting before the beginning, as I like to call it, thinking about the role of slavery and settler colonialism in the American founding. We're going to be looking at the lead article from the New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and also an article about settler colonialism in early American history. Then we'll turn to the kind of foundations of the American Republic in the Revolutionary War, Declaration of Independence, and the creation of the Constitution, with our goal to kind of think about how these different histories of the foundation of the country have influenced politics and continue to influence politics today. We'll also have our first current events Friday next week as well. So to wrap things up, the minute paper question for this week, again, you can go to bit.ly/capital P lowercase OLS 101 capital M capital P. And again, the link is on the Moodle page as well. And answer the following question. Explain the third phase of power in your own words and give an example of something that might be shaped by this ideological or sociological power. As always, don't forget to ask any questions in that last box in the chart in the Google form that you want to go over in our discussion sections this week. That's it for this mini lecture on the three faces of power. I hope this was clear, help you better understand the Gaventa piece. I look forward to having our discussion this week. As always, take care, and I will see you in class.